In the 1970s, when Cambodia was waged by the civil wars and was under the Khmer Rouge atrocities, about more than 100,000 of Cambodians were admitted as refugees to the United States in the 1990s. But about 10,000 of them were placed in the Bronx, one of the poor communities in New York City where poverty was and still is rampant. But how was it for the Cambodian refugees to resettle in the Bronx? What kinds of help did they receive? And what were the kind of challenges they faced and continue to face today? To find out more about this, we have Professor Eric Tang from University of Texas in our TV studio today. He recently finished his first book that shed light on the journey of the former Cambodian refugee in the Bronx in the 1970s and the 1980s. Welcome to VOA, Professor Eric Tang.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So I want to start our conversation with you telling our audience why you became involved with the Cambodian refugee community in the Bronx in the 1970s and why you decided to write your first book about the community.
So I grew up in New York City, and there are two different Asian Americas. There are those who after the 1960s came as immigrants and came with relative privilege, those who came as professionals. And my parents were part of that wave, that post-1965 wave. But there was another Asian America that resettled to the United States during that time. And these were less fortunate Asian Americans, many of them poor immigrants, and many of them who had suffered the atrocities of war, and in the case of the Cambodians, genocide. And as I grew older into like the 1990s, early 2000s, I decided to dedicate part of my life to working with less fortunate Asian Americans, Cambodian refugees in particular, who had been resettled to the Bronx, because I felt that there was a connection we shared as Asian Americans, but at the same time I knew that some of us were more privileged than others. And it was important for those of us who were more privileged to work in the service and work alongside those who had less fortunate paths. Mm-hmm.
In your book, as I skimmed through it, you talked about the story of Rapron, and I want to know more about her and her story. And most importantly, I want to know how her story can exemplify the other story of many Cambodian refugees who came to the United States between 1970 and 1990s.
Right. So Rapron came to the United States in 1986. I didn't meet her until I was working in the Bronx during the late 90s. So about 10 or 12 years after she got to the US. And I worked with her as a community organizer, helping her with issues around housing problems, welfare problems. And I worked with her children, her teenage children, who were part of a youth program that I directed. Well, after I left my community organizing work and I became a professor, I decided to write about my experiences in the Bronx. And I wanted to write about all the different aspects of life for these refugees, the ongoing struggles that they faced in the U.S. People think that their struggles end once they arrive and they resettle. It's not true. They continue to deal with poverty, street violence, police harassment, unemployment. And I looked at all of these areas and I said, okay, I can interview this person about poverty, this person about welfare trouble. And then I interviewed Ra. I remembered Ra, and I said, wait a minute, she's this woman who has experienced all of this, in one life over the course of 3 decades in the Bronx. And it dawned on me that I could write the book about her and her experiences moving from one struggle to the next and tell the story that I wanted to tell about the broader Cambodian community, because her story exemplified so much of what so many people in that community had gone through.
Mm-hmm. Earlier you mentioned that your parents were, migrated or immigrated to the United States in the 1960s, but their story kind of different because they were from the, a professional class. And I'm wondering how their story as the immigrants to the United States help you draw the line of comparison to understand what kind of challenges these Cambodian refugees were facing, and the help and the kind of help and the assistance that they needed the most during the first phase of their resettlement in the United States, particularly in the Bronx.
So, you know, when we grow up as Asian immigrant or the children of Asian immigrants in the U.S., you know, we deal with discrimination. We deal with issues of feeling like socially marginalized, not understood, and you know, we deal with having to navigate between two worlds: the world of our parents and, you know, mainstream American culture, for lack of a better term. And this becomes a point of unity for many different Asian groups. We begin to see ourselves as one race, you know, one racial formation, Asian Americans. We all experience a common form of discrimination. But then what happens is you begin to forget that among Asian Americans, there's also a lot of difference. There's a lot of economic difference. There's a lot of differences when it comes to educational background. And it dawned on me when I was in college that it wasn't enough for me to just talk about the discrimination I faced as a middle class, you know, Asian American, the child of immigrants, but that if I really wanted to address inequality, discrimination, that I had to look at where it was most pronounced and most severe. And I had to look at communities that were even more marginalized than my own to really understand what it meant to be Asian American. And so that inspired me to work with the Cambodian refugee population in the Bronx. So that's the long story. The short story is too, I actually was looking for good work to do, and then this organization called CAV in New York City said, well, you seem enthusiastic, we have a project up in the Bronx, why don't you go check it out? I didn't know what I was getting into, but to make a long story short, it defined the next 10 years of my life, and I'm, you know, the beneficiary of that wonderful experience.
So on Rapron's journey to the Bronx in the 1970s, I want you to tell us how her story, you know, tell us the successes or the failure of the U.S. resettlement policy back then.
So Rapron was displaced from her homeland in Cambodia during the 1970s. She spent most of the 1980s in a refugee camp in Thailand, and then she was resettled to the Bronx, New York during the mid to late 1980s. And from the mid-1980s through the present, you would think that her life got better. Clearly, right? She's someone who survived war and genocide. But the reality is, she, along with the majority of Cambodians living in the Bronx, experienced extreme poverty. They lived in poor housing. They were subjected to a welfare state that didn't treat them kindly, but often punished them for being poor. And just to give you some statistics, about 24% of the Cambodian population in the Bronx by the year 2000 was unemployed. The poverty rate was near 50%, and about 80% were receiving some form of welfare. And so their struggles continued, clearly, in the new land, right, in the promised land. And Rapron's experiences exemplify all of that. She was somebody who was constantly moved from one housing situation to another, one bad situation to another because of one calamity and followed by another one. She was chronically unemployed until she could find work doing sweatshop labor at home or working for below minimum wage in factories in New Jersey with very poor conditions. And she was on welfare for many years, but by 1996, 10 years into her time here in the US, the federal government passed a law severely limiting people's welfare, and that created new struggles for her. At the same time, she ran into trouble with the child welfare system. So all these things continued on. And one of the things that I write about is how Rapran, when she was living in the Bronx, never lived in one place for more than 4 years. She was always being moved. But she spent 4.5 years in the Khawidang refugee camp in Thailand. So what does that tell us? It tells us that, in fact, her life in the refugee camp was more stable than was her life in the Bronx, if we just look at the numbers of years of residency in one place. So that's why I thought it was important to write about her story.
Let's talk about now. 3 decades has passed, and since the first former Cambodian refugee was placed in the Bronx. How best can you tell us the lives of the former Cambodian refugee and particularly their children?
So one would hope that the second and third generation, the children and grandchildren of the refugees, are going to do better than their parents and grandparents. Like, that's the story we want to tell. But the truth is that for many of these young Cambodians coming of age today, they continue to struggle with working poverty. They continue to be just one paycheck away or one illness away from falling into, extreme poverty. Cambodian young people do not go to college anywhere near the same rate as their other Asian American counterparts. And in addition to that, many of them are profiled, targeted by a criminal justice system, which sees them as part of a generation of inner city youth who don't really have a productive role in society. We're also dealing with a number of young Cambodian, mostly men, who have felony convictions, and as a result of that are subject to deportation. All right? And so there is a group of so-called returnees, deportees, now in Phnom Penh, who in some cases have never been to Cambodia before because they were born in the Thai refugee camps. And yet the United States feels it's appropriate to deport them because they think that they're deporting Cambodian crime back to Cambodia, when in fact these young people grew up here in the United States, and their difficult situation led them down certain paths, which led them into the criminal justice system. So, as much as I would like to tell you that there are many success stories when it comes to the children and grandchildren of refugees, the truth is that it remains very difficult for these young people. And that has to do with, or it stems from, not having a clear economic and social policy after resettlement for these refugees.
For my last question, right now in the United States, it is the year of presidential election, and among candidates from Republican and Democratic Party, there has been an ongoing debate and discussion about the U.S. resettlement policy to accept Syrian refugees who are escaping a civil war in their country. I'm wondering how your book, which sheds so much light on the experiences of these Cambodian refugees who are today still, struggle with social economic inequality, the lack of affordable health care, if you will, can shape the narrative as to what a strong resettlement policy should look like for the U.S.
So right now, the discourse around refugees and their admittance to the United States is in an unfortunate place. Refugee resettlement has historically been a bipartisan issue in the US, meaning that both parties agree it's a good thing to resettle refugees. What we're seeing now is a lot of polarization because people think that refugees are now a security threat. And this leaves no room in the public discussion about not only resettling them, but what they need once they get here, right? The kind of support that they need. And if my book does anything, it points to how our resettlement policy cannot end at just allowing people in here and providing them housing, right? It has to also integrate a long-term economic plan for how they're going to develop the kind of social capital, right? The human capital they need to pull themselves out of poverty once they get here. So my book focuses on the failures, really, of a resettlement policy that doesn't pay attention to, for instance, job training, allowing people to heal from their trauma before we push them into, sweatshop jobs, right? The failures of a social state that doesn't provide enough support for them as they transition from being refugees to immigrants to residents, right? But would sooner cut their welfare and other forms of support that they need to really build a life here in the US. And so what I hope is that my book can talk about the importance of resettling refugees and move us away from this polarizing discussion, this discriminatory discussion against refugees, but B, also talk about how we plan for the long haul, right? How we develop policies that are meaningful, that pull people out of poverty, and we don't allow the cycles of poverty to continue that are exemplified in this book that I wrote called Unsettled.
Thank you so much, Professor Eric Tang, for joining us today.
Thank you.